When you're a writer, you often find yourself seeking out as much writing advice as you can find. You'll turn to the greats, to your favorite writers, to anyone who has done what you're trying to do, in the hopes that they have it all figured out. Ultimately, I think we're all looking for that one piece of advice that will unlock all the mysteries of writing and help us conquer the unfinished projects we have rattling around in our heads. And maybe my channel will help you in that way at some point in your journey. But I've discovered something about myself, and I wonder if the same may be true of others. But I often default to some of the earliest advice I ever heard. Sometimes that's familiar advice we hear repeated from many authors, like write every day. Sometimes it's advice about structure. To this day, everything that I've really retained about structuring a screenplay came from a UCLA writing camp I participated in when I was about 15 years old. But if I'm completely honest, whenever I get started on a new project and I'm facing the tyranny of the blank page, I think about the movie Finding Forrester.
You're the man now, dog.
Finding Forrester is a basically forgotten Sean Connery movie from the early 2000s, where Connery plays a J.D. Salinger-style, reclusive writer who shut himself away from the world after the release of his one big successful novel. However, he ends up befriending Jamal Wallace, a teenage basketball player from Harlem with a lot of potential as a writer, and William Forrester ends up being Jamal's secret writing coach. Meanwhile, Jamal has also been accepted into a very prestigious prep school on a basketball scholarship, and ends up in a romance with Anna Paquin and a hostile relationship with the snooty writing professor who doesn't believe Jamal is as good as he claims, played by F. Murray Abraham. And I'll be honest, this movie is, it's fine. It's got some great scenes. Overall, I don't think it's necessarily anything special. It's not a hidden gem, but it's not a bad movie. You probably wouldn't turn it off if you were watching it, but I do think outside of a few moments, it is kind of forgettable. Unless you're me. Because somehow this movie shaped who I am as a writer. There are lessons in this film I think about every time I sit down to write just about anything. And recently I rewatched it again for the first time in probably a decade, and I forgot something about it that confuses me every time I see the film. For some reason, this movie opens by showing the filmmakers. This is the first shot of the film. After the studio logos play, the first thing we see is a clapperboard for the film we're watching. And then we watch a real rapper from Harlem perform a song straight into the camera. And as he performs, we see a montage of the people in Harlem, and then the film continues, and we never again see any of the filmmakers. Nobody else ever breaks the fourth wall again. So, why did they do that? And how does this choice represent the core lesson the movie has to teach us about writing? Finding Forrester is all about writing. When Ebert and Roper reviewed the film, Richard Roper talked about how hard it is to make writing interesting on screen, but he said this film does a good job depicting the world of writing. And I do agree on some level. We're going to talk soon about a lot of the great writing advice presented in the movie, because there is some genuinely great advice here. However, before we get to that, I think I should say this film does struggle with how to depict that Jamal is a talented writer. So it defaults to a simple trick, which is the same trick the director, Gus Van Sant, used to depict Will Hunting's genius in Good Will Hunting. Namely, we're told a lot. We're not shown a lot. Sure, when we see Jamal's room for the first time, he's got a stack of well-worn paperbacks, so he's a voracious reader. That's good visual storytelling. Later at school, we see him secretly writing in his locker, hiding the notebook behind the locker door so nobody knows what he's doing. Again, a great visual representation of what he's got going on. And then he meets the guy who delivers Forrester's groceries, and this guy drives a BMW and gives Jamal a little bit of attitude, and so we get this movie's version of the bar scene from Good Will Hunting.
No, it's not just a car. It's a BMW. Oh. Because anybody who knows anything about that company knows that it's more than just a car.
Oh, anybody who knows anything about that company, so I wouldn't know anything like that, right?
No, that's not what I meant.
Last thing I knew about BMW is they used to make these plane engines when they first started. A guy by the name of Franz Pop started it all. Franz Pop. I like that name. Made this one engine before 1920. Flew 6 miles up. But Pop and his boys, it was just getting started, man. Made this one engine, the 801, World War II, 14 cylinders, 2,300 horsepower, 7 miles up. Now, if they had more time, they would have been bombing the shit out of England and maybe even won the war. That's where this comes from. White propeller zipping around a blue sky. So after the war, we told them that they couldn't make plane engines anymore. And that's when BMW gave some serious thought to making cars. Kind of like this one. But you probably knew all that being as you leased one and all.
So the film shows us the same thing in this scene that we saw in the bar scene, that Jamal is brilliant. And that's not exclusive to Good Will Hunting. Lots of movies depict brilliant people by having them spout off facts. I think we especially saw a rise in this trope after Good Will Hunting, but I also can't say I blame the filmmakers here. There are not that many ways to show characters being smart on screen, so having the ability to easily recall information is a really convenient shorthand for intelligence. After all, by doing this, you can show that they don't just read a lot, but they do absorb the information they read. This film pulls this trick a few times, such as when Jamal mouths along with Forrester as he quotes a great writer. And we also see this trick in my favorite scene in the film.
You will hear the beat of a horse's
Kipling.
feet.
We'll get there soon. However, Jamal is not like Will Hunting. Will was a genius who barely had to put in any effort to do genius-level math. He does read a lot, but the narrative makes it clear that this ability to recall everything is unique. It's just a skill granted to him by his very good brain. Jamal is a voracious reader and a gifted writer, but wait, how do we know he's a gifted writer? Well, we're told. We never really hear much of Jamal's writing, we only hear how wonderful it is. And when people discuss his writing, we don't even really get any specifics. It's just great. But in what way? Is he a gifted wordsmith? Does he have great ideas? Is he writing fiction or just essays? At one point in the film, he has to write an essay for Professor Crawford's class, and it was inspired by something Forrester had written and printed in the New Yorker, so presumably, this was an essay as well. Forrester reads Jamal's work to the school at the end of the film, and based on what little we hear, this seems to be another essay, written in first person and discussing, well, we can't really get a great sense of it because we only hear a few lines from it. We don't really get any idea of what makes it so special or even really what it's about outside of some broad strokes. We're frequently told how great a writer Jamal is, but we don't get a chance to see it for ourselves. And that's a shame because much of the film revolves around Jamal being a great writer. In fact, the core drama of the movie is that Professor Crawford thinks Jamal's writing is too good and doesn't believe he's actually writing the work that he turns in. Even before Jamal actually does submit derivative work, Crawford is already suspicious, just because Jamal is a good writer.
You don't think he wrote it? That's a serious accusation, Robert. You come to the faculty board with something like this.
I'm aware of how serious it is.
It's remarkable work. The boy does well in my class. He had good scores coming in. Maybe all he needed was some direction.
Carl, he's a basketball player from the Bronx.
Oh, but have you considered that he might just be that good?
Not this good.
Crawford has Jamal write his next essay in his office, which Jamal is not able to do, so he submits writing from his session with Forrester, which he's not supposed to do and which gets him into trouble. But before those consequences come to pass, his frustration with Crawford boils over, and he demonstrates in front of the class exactly how gifted he is. And how does he do that? By reciting a bunch of stuff he's got memorized. It starts when Crawford is in the midst of embarrassing another student for not knowing who wrote the passage on the chalkboard, and Jamal speaks up because he does know it. And then Crawford pushes Jamal just a bit too far.
Perhaps your skills do extend a bit farther than basketball. Turn to page 120 in the little blue book that I'm certain...
Further.
I'm sorry?
You said my skills extend farther than the basketball court. Farther relates to distance. Further is a definition of degree. You should have said further.
Credit to this film, this scene is how I remember the difference between farther and further to this day. But then Crawford engages Jamal in a challenge.
It is a melancholy truth that even
Great men have poor relations. Dickens.
You will hear the beat of a horse's
Kipling.
feet. All great truths begin...
Shaw.
Man is the only animal
That blushes. Or needs to. It's Mark Twain. Come on, Professor Crawford.
Get out. Get out.
It's a great scene, and it's one of the few moments in the movie where Jamal isn't entirely passive. He's actively pushing back, and we love to see it. We love to see Crawford being put in his place. But it also demonstrates two of the only tricks the filmmakers have to demonstrate what a great writer Jamal is. He knows the rules about writing, and he's memorized a lot of information. And it's honestly a shame that the film has to default to these two techniques so often, because the movie does have good advice about writing. So let's talk about the writing lessons in Finding Forrester. This film's best advice has to do with how hard it is to actually get started when you're writing.
I just can't seem to get past the first 10 pages, though.
As I recall, it's quite a while to get past those pages myself.
The scene that I think has the best writing advice, and certainly the one that had the biggest impact on me, comes from the first moment Jamal sits down for a writing session with Forrester.
Is there a problem?
No, I'm just thinking.
No. No thinking. That comes later.
This scene contains the big piece of advice I remember the most from this film, and it's broken into two parts. The first is one that I think most writers would agree with. Don't worry about making it good on your first draft. Just get to writing. Roger Ebert discussed this in his written review of the film. The movie contains at least 2 insights into writing that are right on target. The first is Williams' advice to Jamal that he give up waiting for inspiration and just start writing. My own way of phrasing this rule is, the muse visits during composition, not before. So there you go, see? This movie has good advice about writing. Except this scene continues, and we get a piece of advice I'd never heard before, and one that I can only recommend with several asterisks, despite the fact that I've been carrying this advice with me throughout my writing career for a couple of decades now.
What's this?
Start typing that. Sometimes a simple rhythm of typing gets us from page 1 to page 2. And when you begin to feel your own words, start typing them.
Okay, so I actually do agree with this advice. Well, yeah, I guess, of course I do. I'm talking about the writing lessons that have stuck with me for more than 20 years. Maybe a better way to say it is, I've used this advice, kind of, and I felt like it's worked for me. At its core, I feel like this is advice about how to enter a creative flow state. If you're not familiar with the term flow, you certainly know the terms in the zone or in a groove. Flow just means you get into a mental state where you get immersed in your work, you lose track of time, and you just focus entirely on the task at hand. And there's a lot of advice out there about how to enter flow and cut out distractions. I'm generally terrible at following a lot of that advice, if I'm completely honest, but despite that, I can still usually get into a good writing rhythm and get into flow. And sometimes that just comes from the act of typing. You just sit down and start writing anything that will get your fingers moving, and that will help you get into the rhythm you need to be in to actually produce some pages. However, despite this being one of the few pieces of writing advice that pops into my head every time I sit down at the keyboard, I definitely don't start by typing up something that's already been written. You might notice that's a little bit ethically dodgy to start writing something that you're serious about, like an essay or a video script or a screenplay or a novel, by literally transcribing another piece of writing until you figure out what it is you want to say, and only deviating then. But this is where my imperfect memory played a role here, because I'd always assumed this is just one of the pieces of advice Forrester gave Jamal to help improve his writing, but I'd forgotten the context around it. I'd forgotten this was never meant to be anything except a writing exercise.
Jamal, whatever we write in this apartment stays in this apartment. No exceptions.
Yeah, of course Forrester wasn't teaching Jamal how to plagiarize. That would be absurd. I don't think there's anything wrong with being inspired by another essay or a story or whatever, so once you hit the point where you're writing your own words, I do think you could just delete everything else you'd written up to that point and start typing what you want to say, as long as it is sufficiently different. Or maybe go and put that section in quotes and cite it as a source and then write your response to it if you're literally incorporating those words into your writing. I don't know. The specifics aren't really the point. The point is, this advice is sound on some level. On the other hand, it's also pretty easy to abuse. When Jamal needs to turn in some writing to Professor Crawford, he turns in the essay that started with Forrester's words. And it turns out, oops, this was one of the few pieces of writing Forrester did get published. It was an essay in the New Yorker, and so Jamal gets in trouble for plagiarizing the title and introduction to his essay. So yeah, obviously the lesson here is, this may be one approach to getting something onto the page, breaking through the barrier of how to actually start and get into flow state, but don't just start transcribing something into your document if you plan to do anything with that writing, like submit it or publish it. I also want to quickly round up some of the other writing advice in the movie that I really like.
Punch the keys, for God's sake!
I do that. I type really hard. It's very distracting to everyone I've ever known and worked with. Anyone who hears me typing assumes I'm angry, but no, I type with gusto.
Just keep in mind that bitterly disappointed teachers can be either very effective or very dangerous.
I like this advice a lot more now that I'm an adult who is no longer in school, and I can look back in hindsight and see the benefits that I got from some of my more frustrating teachers. The reason this is in the movie is to foreshadow Crawford's role as the primary antagonist, and maybe also to draw a distinction between Crawford and Forrester, who is also bitter and disappointed, but is a very effective teacher. But I actually do think this is helpful advice for young people with teachers or mentors. I had a college professor who was very frustrating to work with, who would push back against everything, whose arguments made no sense, who often misunderstood pretty basic ideas in my writing, and was not always actually great at delivering lessons and lectures either. However, once I got out of school and moved to Hollywood, doing internships and working on the very edges of the industry, I started realizing some of the things he'd been trying to teach us. I still maintain his teaching style got in the way, a lot of his lessons were obscured by confusing rhetoric and weird logic leaps, but I started to understand that he was disappointed. It now seemed like he'd been chewed up and spit out by Hollywood, and so with hindsight, I started to wonder if he was trying to give his students whatever advice he could, maybe so we wouldn't fall into his mistakes. Although I still learned more about writing from all the screenwriting books I used to devour than I ever did from that professor. Although the film also has a warning about that, about the writers who know all the rules to writing, like the ones you would learn from books.
A lot of writers know the rules about writing, but they don't know how to write.
There's also an extended scene where Forrester and Jamal discuss whether it's okay to start a sentence with a conjunction, and it kind of takes way too long to get around to the ultimate point of, yeah, we know it's a rule, but it's fine, lots of great writers do it, just don't overuse it. But yeah, apart from the advice about getting into flow, this is probably the most actionable piece of writing advice in the movie. The scene it's in is just a lot less interesting than the typewriter scene. And it's an example of what we talked about earlier. The film is trying to show us that Jamal is a great writer by telling us he knows the rules about writing. Except this film also demonstrates some genuinely useful writing advice here. It's okay to know the rules about writing, but you're also allowed to break them in the service of your writing. And that is a valuable lesson.
Some of the best writers have been ignoring that rule for years, including you.
And the last major piece of advice in the film isn't even really advice, but it is something that stuck with me for a long time. Because I'm awful at reading aloud. Somewhat surprisingly, considering my current career involves me reading off of a teleprompter. But this is very much a learned skill, and it is one that I'm still improving. It's a challenge for me to read aloud. I get ahead of myself, I combine words, I stumble, I rush. It's tough. And this film is actually really validating and reminding me that it's not actually an indication of the quality of your writing if you struggle to read it aloud.
Well, they make all the students get up and read in front of everybody.
What the hell's that got to do with writing? Writers write so that readers can read. Let someone else read it.
You ever read your own book?
In public? Hell no. Barely read it in private.
But this film also has a lot to say about the reaction of the public to your writing.
You ever enter one of those?
Writing contest?
Yeah.
Once. A long time ago.
Did you win?
Well, of course I won.
Like money or something?
The Pulitzer.
Oh.
Forrester is rightfully very proud of the success of his novel. At one point, Jamal refers to back in the day when people used to read Forrester's book, and Forrester bristles at that, and so he sends Jamal out to check the library to see if he can actually find a copy of the book anywhere. But of course he can't, because they've all been checked out, because even 50 years later, the book is still that popular.
You know those things you do, that coffee shop reading shit? Mm-hmm. You know why they do it?
Sell books, I guess.
Because they want to get laid.
Oh, really? Women will sleep with you if you write a book?
Women will sleep with you if you write a bad book.
Did it ever happen to you?
Sure.
Okay, so we know he certainly didn't mind the, praise he got from his audience. But when it comes to the more substantial feedback, the film is a lot less charitable about that.
Do you know what the absolute best moment is? It's when you've finished your first draft. You read it by yourself. Before these assholes take something that they couldn't do in a lifetime and tear it down in a single day.
People love that book, man.
I didn't write it for them. When the critics started all this bullshit about what it was I was really trying to say, well, I decided then, well, one book was enough.
This comes up a lot throughout the movie. Forrester is hostile about any interpretation of the hidden meaning of his work, in part because he associates these interpretations with a particularly traumatic moment in his life, which he describes in the best scene in the film. I know the challenge scene is my favorite scene, but the baseball field scene is the best scene.
My brother and I, we were here for every game. Till he left for the war. I thought it would be the same when he came back, but he talked a little less, drank a little more. I just stood there and watched him drive off. Makes it through the whole goddamn war. I let him drive. Later that night, the nurse was typing, whatever it is, they type on. And you know what she tells me? She tells me how much my book meant to her. My brother's getting cold in the next room, and all she can talk about is a book.
And this is ultimately a tension in the film that doesn't really get resolved. At the end of the movie, Forrester finally leaves the apartment. He actually plans to return to Scotland for the first time in decades. And then we jump ahead to Jamal's senior year, and a surprise Matt Damon cameo arrives to tell us that Forrester passed away of cancer, which the film implies he either discovered shortly after his time with Jamal, or my interpretation is he already knew about the cancer when he met Jamal. But he did write another novel while he was away, which he intended to be published posthumously. So the victory here is that Jamal brought Forrester out of his shell to see the world and to write once more. And I have no doubt that William Forrester's second and final novel, written while he was terminally ill and traveling the world, titled Sunset and published posthumously, would be a banger. But he'll never know, because he got to avoid interacting with any criticism of his work by waiting until he had died to have it published. The film never reconciles what to do about critics. Maybe the film didn't have an answer, which is ironic because the critics were pretty kind to the movie. They agreed that it's predictable, but it's still good. As I said earlier, Roger Ebert really liked it, and Richard Roeper thought it was one of the 10 best movies of the year. And in fact, 10 years later, he still called it one of the 100 best movies of the decade. And yet, the film seems to be both jaded against critics and also against audience interpretation. Hell, we learned at one point that Crawford was writing a book about 4 great writers, and one of them was Forrester. In fact, he was the only one of the 4 who was still alive. So Forrester told the publishers he was working on another book, which he was not, that was a lie. But if any publisher wanted his book, they couldn't bid on Crawford's. Forrester was so against any interpretation of his work that he ended a man's career. And this is meant to be a good thing because Crawford is a jerk? I don't know, man, maybe this is why Crawford's a jerk, you know? And this is something I pretty strongly disagree with the film about, because I think analysis and critique is vitally important. People should be allowed to do that. Now, that doesn't mean the writer has to like it, it doesn't even mean the writer has to engage with it. But people should be able to, criticize and analyze art. And so in the spirit of good faith criticism and analysis, I'm going to analyze the hell out of this movie by focusing on one shot. I think great art provokes one of 2 reactions from other writers. You read it, or watch it, or listen to it, and you either think, wow, I could never make something that good. Or you react by saying, wow, somebody made something that good. It's possible for someone to make great art. Someone who is just a normal person can create something great. And if they could do it, I bet I could too. I have always been far more interested in and excited about the latter of those 2 reactions. I don't think it's useful to look at the work of any artist and claim they're just a genius or a once-in-a-generation mind. I wouldn't argue against the idea that some people are truly talented, but every piece of art you've ever seen that's moved you was made by an artist who trained to get that good, a process that probably took several years, if not decades. When I think about the art that inspires me to create my own great art, something like Hamilton is right at the top of that list. Say what you will about the play or its politics or whatever, and we'll probably talk about that some other day, but viewed purely as a product of its own, as a work of art, I think Hamilton is a masterpiece. However, it's the kind of masterpiece that makes me excited about writing. It doesn't intimidate me, it inspires me. Maybe that's because it was literally about someone who, according to the text of the play, was constantly writing, written by a playwright and lyricist who was also constantly writing. But I actually think the reason Hamilton feels like an inspiring work of art may have more to do with the fact that there's so much footage and so many articles and so many interviews about how Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote Hamilton, and how the show came together. Miranda made no secrets of the parts of the play that he struggled with, of the songs he had to rewrite multiple times, of the parts of the story that he fabricated because he felt the truth would not be as compelling. Again, love him or hate him, Miranda was very clearly attempting to demystify his process, because he wanted to inspire the next generation of artists. Now, Finding Forrester is no Hamilton, I don't think anybody would debate that. The only cultural impact this film had was that a single line inspired someone to create the website you'rethemannowdog.com, which managed to stick around almost entirely unchanged for nearly 20 years. But I do believe this film shares a similar goal to something like Hamilton, because neither one of them want you to simply sit back and admire the writers they made up. They want you to take these lessons and apply them to your own work and your own life. This film wants to illustrate that great writing doesn't just magically happen, you have to put the work in. Now, I don't know if I think the film entirely succeeds in that goal, because they also want us to think Jamal is a brilliant writer, essentially a prodigy, and due to the shorthand tricks they use, he kind of just winds up being depicted as a generic movie genius.
I forgot what the question was.
You don't forget anything.
But on the other hand, Jamal isn't complacent. He seeks out someone who can teach him how to improve his own writing. He reads constantly to better familiarize himself with other great writing. The film demonstrates that even if you do have a talent, that's not necessarily enough. You also have to apply yourself and put the work in.
Is there a problem?
No, I'm just thinking.
No. No thinking. That comes later.
I believe the filmmakers want you to leave the movie with the lesson that art doesn't just happen. People have to make it. And so at last we come back to that opening shot. Why does the movie open by showing the filmmakers? And then why do we watch this young hip-hop artist stare at the audience as he performs? Because the film is trying to demystify art. By opening a movie with a clapper for the exact same movie we're about to watch, this film reminds us that this movie didn't simply materialize. People made it. It strips away the artifice right at the top to tell you that you are watching a work of fiction. And I would even argue that by showing this young rapper looking into the camera as he performs, they wanted you to think that what you're watching is essentially like a documentary. Like this is just some guy that they found while they were filming. And maybe he was. But this is a truly surreal moment. And if we look at the movie that follows, I think we can draw some additional meaning from the sequence at the beginning. The filmmakers are trying to tell you exactly who made the film. Some of their names are on the clapper. And then we see someone who is clearly a talented performer showing off his skills. And once we combine this with the movie that follows, I believe the lesson here is clear. You could do it too.